Part 1. The shocking encounter. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and as the CEO stepped into the bustling office floor, he felt the tension in the air. It wasn't the usual hum of productivity, it was something darker, something hidden beneath the surface. This was supposed to be his undercover experiment. He had disguised himself as a low-level employee, ready to observe his company from a different angle. But nothing could have prepared him for what awaited him. The office was loud, chaotic, but it wasn't just the noise that caught his attention. No, it was the subtle undercurrents of disdain and disrespect. People walked by with their heads down, glancing nervously at their phones, avoiding eye contact with the senior staff. His eyes landed on one figure standing by the water cooler, talking in hushed tones to a few others. It was the manager, one of the senior leaders, known for his charm, but also his ruthlessness. He had a reputation, and it wasn't a good one. The CEO knew this man well. Too well. What he didn't know was the depth of his arrogance, the toxic nature of his authority that seemed to seep into every corner of the company. He'd heard the whispers in the hallways, the hushed voices, discussing the manager's behavior. But now, seeing it firsthand, it was worse than he ever imagined. Without thinking, the CEO moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest. The manager, oblivious to his presence, was mocking an employee who had just walked by, a woman. The words that left his lips were cruel, laced with thinly veiled sexism. His colleagues around him laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of camaraderie, it was the laugh of someone in power, bullying those beneath him. The CEO's hands clenched into fists. He had expected some form of arrogance, but this was personal. This wasn't just business, it was malicious, intentional. And the worst part? No one seemed to care. The manager's reign was untouchable, his reputation too powerful for anyone to challenge. But that's when the manager saw him. The disguised CEO, standing there watching, with no clue that this ordinary employee wasn't who he seemed. The manager's eyes narrowed, sizing him up. A smug grin spread across his face as he sauntered over to the new recruit, completely unaware of who he was dealing with. Well, what do we have here? The manager sneered. Another lost soul in the trenches, huh? Bet you're here to be my next target for a little fun. Or maybe you're just another one of those invisible drones in the office. Either way, you don't matter. The words hit like a slap to the face. The CEO's pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. He was here for a reason. This was just the beginning. As he looked into the manager's eyes, he realized something. This man didn't know it yet, but his world was about to change. The elevator doors chimed again, and the CEO silently turned away, making his way deeper into the office. The manager's words echoed in his mind. The tension, the fear, the cruelty, it was all about to be exposed. No one knew it yet, but the game was on. And the manager had just made his first move. The CEO sat quietly in the corner of the break room, pretending to sift through a stack of paperwork, but his mind was far away. He had come into the office that morning with a singular goal, to learn the truth about what was happening behind closed doors. His company, one that he had built from the ground up, was thriving on the outside, but whispers of poor morale, sexism, and power struggles were growing louder with every passing day. And then there was the manager. The man who thought himself untouchable, immune to accountability. The CEO had made a decision, he would go undercover. Disguised as an ordinary employee, he would slip into the background and observe, gathering information that would expose the corruption eating away at his company. For weeks, he had planned every detail of his disguise, the clothes, the speech, the quiet demeanor that would allow him to blend into the crowd. No one, not even his most trusted employees, knew that he was walking amongst them, hidden in plain sight. As the CEO sipped his coffee, he watched the employees around him. They barely acknowledged each other, moving quickly to avoid any confrontation. The toxic atmosphere was palpable, but what disturbed him more was the way they behaved around the manager. They walked with their heads low when he passed by, as if they were trying to avoid being noticed, trying not to draw his attention. This wasn't just fear, it was submission. It wasn't long before the manager appeared, striding into the break room with a confident air that made everyone shift uncomfortably. He was the type of man who demanded respect, but it wasn't because he earned it. It was because he commanded it through fear. As the CEO observed from his corner, he noticed the way the manager's presence made the room tense. He heard a couple of whispered comments from the staff, all about the manager's recent behavior, but no one dared to speak out loud. The CEO's jaw clenched. This wasn't just about the manager anymore, it was about the entire environment. How had it come to this? How had a company built on values of teamwork and innovation been reduced to this kind of toxic culture? As the manager began speaking to a small group by the vending machine, the CEO overheard his words. His voice was full of sarcasm, belittling the team's efforts. But it was the way he spoke about women that caught the CEO off guard. He mocked a recent employee's idea, referring to her as another woman who thought she could change things. He laughed, and his laugh echoed through the room like the sound of a bully. This was it. The CEO's gut tightened. The person responsible for all of this, the manager, was standing right in front of him. The man who had made it his mission to undermine others was now the one who would be brought to justice. But first, the CEO had to gather more. He needed to see how deep the roots of this toxic behavior ran. So, he made a silent vow to himself: he would observe, gather proof, and when the time came, he would make the manager's world crumble. He would expose everything. But he knew one thing for sure: the manager was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. And exposing him wouldn't be easy. In fact, it might take everything the CEO had. The days passed by in a blur, but the CEO's resolve only grew stronger. As he continued to navigate the office unnoticed, he began to see the true extent of the power dynamics at play. The manager wasn't just bullying a few people, he was running the company with an iron fist, controlling everything from the smallest decisions to the biggest projects. His actions weren't just a matter of poor leadership, they were a deliberate strategy to maintain control through fear and intimidation. The CEO had already witnessed several moments of cruelty, but now, he began to notice a pattern. The manager singled out employees who were strong, capable, or ambitious, those who could potentially outshine him. These were the people who ended up sidelined, overworked, or even fired under the most absurd pretexts. It was clear, the manager saw talent as a threat. As the CEO sat at his desk one morning, pretending to be absorbed in his work, he overheard a conversation between two employees near the copier. One of them, a woman, was in tears. She had just received an email from the manager, scolding her for something that, in her mind, wasn't even her fault. The other employee, a man, tried to comfort her, but his own voice trembled as he spoke, clearly afraid to get involved. "It's just the way things are around here," the man said softly, "don't take it personally. He'll come up with something else tomorrow." The CEO's chest tightened as he listened. This wasn't just about one manager, it was a culture that had taken root in the company. Fear had become the driving force, not respect, not teamwork. The CEO had built his company on the values of integrity, innovation, and empowerment, but now, everything he had worked for seemed to be crumbling before his eyes. Later that day, he found himself alone in the elevator with the manager. The moment felt like a scene from a nightmare, an innocent ride up to the upper floors turned into a battle of wills. The manager glanced at him, his eyes narrowing with the same smugness that had become so familiar. "Surprised to see you here," the manager sneered. "You don't seem like you belong in this company, do you? Not quite sharp enough, are you?"
The CEO didn't respond, but inside, his mind raced. He knew this man was dangerous, but he didn't know how deep the rot went. The manager's words were designed to provoke, to belittle, to assert dominance. And for a moment, the CEO thought about revealing himself, about ending the game right there and then. But he stopped himself. This wasn't just about one manager anymore. It was about the entire company, the people who were suffering in silence. As the elevator doors opened, the CEO stepped out, his mind made up. He had to dig deeper. He had to expose the manager for who he really was, but he couldn't do it recklessly. One wrong move, and the manager would bury him, just like he had buried so many others. The CEO knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The power struggle had only just begun. But he also knew that in the end, the truth would win. It had to. Because if it didn't, the company he had built would be lost forever. And that was a fate he wasn't willing to accept. The game was shifting. And this time, the CEO wasn't just an observer, he was a player. The day had arrived. The CEO could feel it in the pit of his stomach as he walked through the office halls, his steps deliberate and measured. He had been biding his time, observing, gathering as much information as he could without raising suspicion. But today, something changed. Today, he knew the manager would confront him again. The tension in the office was palpable, as if everyone was waiting for a spark to ignite a fire. The manager had been watching the CEO for days now, and it was only a matter of time before he would approach. The CEO could sense it, and so, he prepared himself. He'd spent hours rehearsing how he would act, how he would answer the manager's inevitable taunts. He couldn't afford to slip up, not when so much was at stake. As expected, the manager's figure loomed in front of him by the water cooler, an almost predatory look in his eyes. The moment their gazes met, the CEO could see the challenge in the manager's stance. This wasn't going to be a simple conversation. Well, the manager said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. If it isn't the new guy. Tell me, how's the grind going for you? You starting to realize that this place isn't as glamorous as it looks from the outside? The CEO didn't flinch. He had prepared for this. The manager's words were nothing more than a thinly veiled attempt to assert his superiority, to remind the CEO of his supposed place in the hierarchy. I'm doing just fine, the CEO replied coolly, pretending to shuffle through some papers in his hand. Just learning the ropes like everyone else. The manager's grin grew wider, but there was an edge to it now, something colder. You know, it's funny, the manager continued, stepping closer. A guy like you, trying so hard to fit in, but I can tell, you'll never make it here. You're not cut out for this kind of work. And the sooner you accept that, the better. The word stung, but the CEO kept his expression neutral. He had expected the manager to attack him personally, it was his go-to tactic. But today was different. Today, the CEO wasn't just an employee. He was a man on a mission, and the manager had just made his first mistake. The CEO met the manager's gaze with quiet intensity. I've been in businesses before. I know what it takes to succeed. Maybe you should try learning from the people around you, instead of tearing them down. The manager's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, the sarcasm dripping from his voice again. You think you're smarter than me? You think you know more than I do? Well, guess what? I've got more power in this building than you could ever imagine. So, you'd better start watching your step. At that moment, something changed. The CEO wasn't just reacting. He was calculating, studying the man in front of him, understanding the depth of the manager's insecurities. It was clear that the manager didn't just want control, he thrived on domination. He needed people to fear him, to respect him out of sheer intimidation. But the CEO wasn't afraid. In fact, he saw right through it. I'm not afraid of you, the CEO said quietly, his voice firm, but calm. And one day, you'll realize that. The manager's face twisted with anger, but before he could respond, the CEO turned and walked away, leaving the confrontation hanging in the air like a storm about to break. As he walked back to his desk, the CEO couldn't help but feel a rush of adrenaline. He had been ready for the fight, but the truth was, he hadn't just exposed the manager's cruelty, he had also seen a crack in his armor. The manager's confidence wasn't as unshakable as it appeared. He was vulnerable. And that was the key to taking him down. But the battle was far from over. The CEO knew that this was only the beginning. The manager would retaliate, but the CEO was prepared. It was time to play the game, and this time, the CEO would be the one calling the shots. The CEO sat alone in his office late that evening, the hum of the fluorescent lights in the corner his only company. The silence was deafening. His thoughts raced through the encounter with the manager, each word from their conversation replaying in his mind. He had been prepared for the arrogance, the power plays, the threats. But there was something about that moment that lingered, something that had shifted within him. He had always been a man of principles, a man who built his company on the ideals of fairness, respect, and hard work. But now, seeing the toxic environment the manager had created, the CEO realized just how far his company had strayed from its original path. What had once been a thriving business, a beacon of innovation and collaboration, was now a place where fear ruled, where people were bullied into silence, and where success wasn't measured by skill or talent, but by how well you played the game of manipulation. The CEO leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, reflecting on everything he had learned. The manager wasn't just a bad employee, he was a symbol of everything wrong with the company. The system itself had allowed a man like him to thrive, unchecked and unchallenged. That wasn't just the manager's fault, it was the fault of the leadership, of those who had turned a blind eye to the toxic culture that had flourished under his reign. But now, the CEO had a choice. He could walk away and let things continue as they were, letting the company fall further into disrepair. Or, he could take action. He could expose the truth, force the company to confront the reality of what had been happening behind closed doors. But doing so wouldn't be easy. It would take more than just courage, it would take strategy, patience, and a willingness to face the consequences. The CEO knew that this wasn't just about one manager anymore. It was about the very future of the company he had worked so hard to build. If he let the manager continue unchecked, there would be no turning back. The culture of fear, of manipulation, would take root so deep that even he wouldn't be able to remove it. But if he exposed the manager now, if he took the risk, there was a chance to rebuild, to restore integrity, and to return the company to its former glory. He stood up from his desk, walking over to the window and looking out at the city skyline. The lights twinkled below, a reminder of the world outside, of the people who were out there working hard every day to make something of themselves. He had a responsibility, not just to the company, but to them, to the people who believed in what the company used to stand for. It was time to make a decision. The CEO had spent years building a reputation for being a fair, just leader. But now, he knew that he was faced with a challenge unlike any he had encountered before. He wasn't just fighting for his company's survival. He was fighting for the values that had once made it great, and he wasn't going to back down. As he turned away from the window, his resolve hardened. The manager had underestimated him. He had thought that the CEO was just another passive bystander, someone to push around. But the CEO wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't going to let anyone destroy the company he had worked so hard to create. Tomorrow, everything would change. The manager's reign was coming to an end, and the CEO was ready to expose the truth, no matter the cost. It was time to take back control. The following day, the tension was palpable. The CEO had spent the night preparing, organizing his evidence, and thinking through his strategy. He knew the risks, knew that exposing the manager would likely cause a ripple effect throughout the company. People would choose sides. There would be backlash. But he had made up his mind. It was time to unmask the truth. The manager strutted into the office that morning as he always did, full of arrogance and confidence, unaware that his days of unchecked power were numbered. He greeted his staff with his usual condescending tone, and the employees, as usual, bowed their heads in submission. But today, something was different. Today, the CEO had a plan. The CEO walked into the meeting room where the manager was holding a conference with the leadership team. His presence in the room was rare. As an undercover employee, he had avoided the upper-level meetings, blending in with the rest of the staff. But today, he knew it was time to reveal himself. Without knocking, he pushed the door open, causing the conversation inside to halt. The manager's eyes widened for a brief second, but quickly, his usual arrogance returned. "Well, look who finally decided to join us," the manager sneered, clearly not realizing the significance of the CEO's unannounced entrance. The CEO locked eyes with the manager and calmly stepped into the room. He wasn't there to play games. He wasn't there to apologize for his intrusion. He was there to confront the truth. "There's something we need to discuss," the CEO said, his voice firm but steady. The room went quiet as everyone in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The CEO took a deep breath and continued, "For too long, you've been allowed to run this company through intimidation, fear, and manipulation. You've made it a toxic place, where employees are afraid to speak up, to be themselves. And I've seen enough." The manager's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "What are you talking about? You have no idea how this company runs." "I think I do," the CEO interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "I've been here long enough to see how you treat your employees, how you belittle their work, how you've made the environment unbearable for anyone who doesn't bow to your will." The CEO turned to the room, addressing the other leaders. "This man has made it his mission to push out anyone who threatens his power. He has created a culture where talent is punished, where diversity is not celebrated, and where fear reigns over respect. And it ends now." The silence in the room was deafening. The employees who had been silent, the ones who had been too afraid to speak up, were now looking at the CEO with a mix of disbelief and hope. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The manager, realizing that his power was slipping away, took a step forward. His eyes burned with rage. "You can't do this. You have no idea what you're up against. You'll ruin everything I've built on lies, built on manipulation," the CEO replied coolly. "You've been running this company like a kingdom, but kingdoms built on fear always fall." The CEO pulled out a folder from under his arm, filled with documents, emails, and recorded conversations that exposed the manager's toxic behavior. "I've gathered everything," he said, laying the evidence on the table. "And I'll make sure the entire company knows the truth." The manager's face paled as the weight of his actions settled in. He had never anticipated the CEO would come after him this way, not with such precision and confidence. But now, there was nowhere for him to hide. "I won't let you do this," the manager spat, his voice shaking with fury. "I don't need your permission," the CEO replied coldly. "The truth speaks for itself." As the CEO stood tall in front of the manager, he could feel a sense of relief wash over him. He had taken the first step in righting the wrongs that had been allowed to persist for far too long. The manager may have thought he was invincible, but today, the CEO had proven that even the most powerful figures could be brought to their knees by the truth. Now, the battle was far from over. There would be consequences. There would be backlash. But the CEO knew one thing for sure: the company would never be the same again. The toxic reign of the manager had ended, and it was time to rebuild. But for now, the CEO had won. The truth had been unmasked, and the manager's empire was crumbling. The days after the confrontation were anything but easy. The news of the manager's exposure spread quickly throughout the company, and the fallout was swift and intense. Employees, once too afraid to speak up, now felt emboldened. Some voiced their support for the CEO, while others feared the consequences of what was to come. The air in the office was thick with tension, and no one knew what to expect next. The CEO, while pleased with his decision to expose the manager, now found himself in the midst of a storm. The company's leadership team was divided. Some were loyal to the manager, too afraid to speak out against his toxic reign. Others saw the truth in the CEO's actions, but the damage was already done. Trust had been broken. Relationships had been fractured. The manager, once so confident, now found himself on the defensive, scrambling to save what little credibility he had left. The CEO knew the man wouldn't go down without a fight, but it was clear that the manager's power was slipping away. He was a shell of the figure he had once been, and the CEO couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. But that didn't mean the CEO was without his own challenges. As the head of the company, he had a responsibility to make sure the aftermath was handled with care. He couldn't just focus on tearing down the old system, he had to rebuild it from the ground up. He had to restore trust among the employees, make them feel safe again, make them believe in the company's original mission. The first step was to address the employees. The CEO called an all-staff meeting, where he addressed the situation head-on. There would be no sugarcoating, no pretending that everything was okay. The CEO spoke honestly about what had happened, explaining the reasons behind his actions and what steps would be taken to ensure the company could heal. "I know this has been hard," the CEO said, his voice steady but filled with empathy. "But this is the first step in reclaiming the company we all built together. We've allowed fear and manipulation to thrive for too long. And it ends now." He took a deep breath, looking around at the faces in the room. He saw uncertainty, fear, but also hope. He wasn't just talking to them, he was trying to show them that things could be different. "We're going to rebuild," he continued. "And we're going to do it together. I need your trust, and I need your commitment. This company can be what we've always dreamed of, a place where everyone has a voice, a place where we can all succeed together. But it won't happen overnight. It'll take time, and it will take effort. But we'll get there." There was a long silence after he finished speaking. Then, slowly, hands began to rise. Employees who had once been too afraid to speak now stood up, voicing their support. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. The trust was beginning to rebuild, piece by piece. But even as the CEO faced the difficult task of restoring order, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be done. The manager was still out there, still plotting, still trying to salvage what was left of his reputation. But the CEO knew that the truth was now on his side, and that would be the thing that ultimately made all the difference. For the CEO, this wasn't just about restoring the company, it was about restoring integrity, about creating a workplace where everyone felt valued and respected. It would be a long road ahead, but the first step had been taken. The truth had been exposed, the toxic reign had ended, and now it was time to rebuild. And as he looked around at the faces in the room, the CEO realized something: this was only the beginning. What would come next would define not just the future of the company, but his own legacy as a leader. Would he be remembered as the man who exposed the truth? Or would he be remembered as the man who changed the company for the better? One thing was for certain: the journey had just begun, and the CEO was ready to face whatever came next. In the weeks that followed the manager's exposure, the CEO worked tirelessly to stabilize the company. The initial shock had worn off, but the deep cracks within the company's structure were still visible. While many employees rallied behind the CEO, eager for change, others were still hesitant, their trust shaken by years of fear and manipulation. The manager, meanwhile, was not going down quietly. His network of loyalists within the company began to rally around him, planting seeds of doubt and resistance. Though he had lost his position, the manager was far from finished. He was still powerful in the eyes of some and was using every tactic he knew to undermine the CEO's efforts. Rumors spread, alliances were tested, and the company was divided as employees debated their loyalty. The CEO knew he had to act quickly. He couldn't afford to let the manager's whispers take root. The company needed to see that the old system of fear was gone for good, that the future was one where integrity, not manipulation, would reign. But dismantling the old order wasn't going to be easy, it would take more than just words. It would take action. He called in his top team and laid out a plan. The manager's toxic behavior had gone unchecked for too long, and it was time to make sure that no one else would try to follow in his footsteps. The CEO would restructure the leadership team, bringing in fresh faces who were committed to transparency and respect. Those who had been complicit in the manager's reign would be held accountable. The company needed to see that things were changing, and that those who had contributed to the toxicity would no longer have a place at the table. But the most important part of the plan was the company-wide initiative the CEO had devised. He would implement a series of workshops, open forums, and mentoring programs to rebuild the culture from the inside out. It was time to empower the employees, to show them that they were the heart of the company. They needed to feel safe, valued, and heard. The CEO's first step was a company-wide meeting, one that would make a bold statement. He stood in front of the entire office, his voice steady but resolute. "This company is about to undergo a transformation," he began. "But it's not just about restructuring the leadership team. It's about changing the way we treat each other. It's about creating an environment where every person feels respected and valued. We will work together to build a culture where integrity and transparency are the foundation of everything we do." The room was quiet. The employees, some skeptical and others hopeful, listened intently as the CEO laid out his vision. This was no longer about exposing one man's toxic behavior, it was about creating something better, something that would last. As the weeks passed, the changes began to take shape. The workshops were a success, with employees sharing their experiences, their frustrations, and their hopes for the future. Slowly, the toxic undercurrents began to dissipate, replaced by a renewed sense of camaraderie and purpose. The company was starting to feel like a place where people could actually thrive. But even as things began to improve, the CEO knew the battle wasn't over. The manager hadn't given up. He had quietly been trying to regroup, to find allies who could help him take back control. The CEO knew that the manager would try to make a comeback. And when he did, the CEO would be ready. For now, though, things were looking up. The company was on the mend, and the CEO had turned the tables. He had taken the first step toward rebuilding the company's culture, and now it was time to continue that journey, one day at a time. The manager's downfall had been only the beginning. The true test would be whether the CEO could hold on to the company's new values and make them stick. The road ahead was still uncertain, but the CEO knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to stop fighting for what was right. The battle for the soul of the company wasn't over, but the CEO had already won the most important victory. He had set things in motion, and there was no going back now. Months passed, and the CEO found himself standing at the edge of a new chapter for the company. The transformation was no longer just an idea, it was a reality. The toxic culture that had once defined the office was now fading into the past, replaced by a renewed sense of teamwork, trust, and mutual respect. The company, which had been on the brink of collapse, was now thriving once again. But the CEO knew that this wasn't just about the company's success. It was about the lesson that had become crystal clear throughout this journey. A lesson not just for him, but for every person in that room. For everyone who had witnessed the chaos, the fear, and the manipulation. For everyone who had ever faced adversity and wondered if things could ever get better. The real lesson was this: change starts with courage. When the CEO had first decided to go undercover, it hadn't been an easy choice. He had to face his fears, confront the truth he didn't want to see, and take a massive risk. But he did it. He had chosen to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against him. He had exposed the truth, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. The hardest part of that decision was realizing that change would come at a cost. The CEO had lost allies, had faced resistance, and had carried the weight of every decision. But he had stayed true to his values, and that commitment had paid off. It wasn't just about bringing down the manager, it was about showing everyone that leadership meant standing up, not just for yourself, but for the people who depended on you. Standing in front of the company's gathered employees one final time, the CEO reflected on how far they had come. "I want you all to understand something," he began, his voice strong but filled with humility. "I didn't make these changes alone. It was your courage, your willingness to speak up, to fight for what's right, that made all of this possible. It wasn't easy. We faced challenges, and we'll face more in the future. But now, we're a team. And that's what will carry us forward." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. Employees were nodding, some with tears in their eyes, others with smiles of quiet satisfaction. There was a sense of unity now, something that had been sorely lacking before. They were no longer just workers, they were partners, allies in the effort to restore the company to its former glory. "Each of you has a voice," the CEO continued. "And it matters. When you speak up, when you stand up for what's right, you're not just helping yourself. You're helping us all. Change doesn't happen when we stay silent. It happens when we come together, when we act with courage and conviction." The room was silent for a moment, and then the applause began. It wasn't a polite clap, it was a roar of approval, of recognition for everything they had accomplished together. The employees, once frightened and intimidated, were now empowered. They had witnessed firsthand the power of standing up against injustice, of fighting for a workplace where respect wasn't just an ideal, but a reality. As the CEO stood there, surrounded by the people who had once felt hopeless, he realized something important: this was his legacy. It wasn't about the title or the position he held. It wasn't about how much money the company made or how successful it became. The true measure of success was in the people he had helped, in the culture he had nurtured. It was in the way he had shown them that no matter how powerful or untouchable someone seemed, change was possible, if you had the courage to fight for it. As the meeting came to a close, the CEO walked out of the room, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The journey had been long, and the battles had been fierce. But in the end, he knew it had all been worth it. Because sometimes, the most difficult battles lead to the most meaningful victories. And in this case, the victory wasn't just in defeating the manager, it was in reclaiming the company's soul and teaching everyone that integrity, courage, and respect would always be the foundation of their success. And that, he realized, was the most valuable lesson of all.